Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the webinar this morning if you're joining us from UK or Western Europe, and hello to everybody else joining us from further afield. So the title for the Carbon Trust webinar today is What Does Climate Leadership Mean for Business in 2019? My name is Tom Cumberledge and I'm joined here by my colleague Pauline Optubek. In terms of introduction, I've been at the Carbon Trust for just over 13 years. When I first joined, I was originally working on many of the public sector programs at Carbon Trust, and I work now within the business services team at Carbon Trust, leading a lot of our work on value chain analysis, setting targets for businesses, and also helping businesses to develop responses to the TCFD. I'm joined by my colleague Pauline, who will introduce herself.
Hello everyone, I'm Pauline Optubek. I've been with the Carbon Trust for 3 years, starting as an analyst delivering a lot of our work, and I now focus on our business development efforts in the UK and also in Europe and the States mainly. And I have a lot of clients in various different sectors focusing on retail and manufacturing and financial services.
Great, so thank you. Before we kick off the main part of the webinar, we thought it'd be helpful just maybe to give a bit of an overview and introduction to the Carbon Trust for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Carbon Trust was set up in 2001. We're a not-for-profit organisation of about 180 staff now. The key thing for us is that we have a mission, and that mission for our organisation is to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. We are a truly international business. We work with governments, with multilateral development banks, businesses, public sector organizations all around the world, helping them to understand their environmental impacts now and how they can contribute to and benefit from a more sustainable future. We've got our main office based in London, but as you can see on the map here, we've got offices globally, and our team really do work with all types of businesses, with global supply chains across those different areas you can see marked across the map there. Most of the team backgrounds at Carbon Trust are either from environmental services, environmental sciences background, professional background in businesses, or indeed engineering. And that mix of backgrounds between business advice, engineering and environmental sciences really helps us provide a range of tailored services to businesses. Specifically for businesses, our main services range from advisory services, consultancy on a range of different climate change issues, many of which we'll talk through today. And also we do offer assurance and certification services as well. Okay, so bringing us back to the topic then, what does climate change leadership mean for businesses in 2019? Well, it's often said that sustainability and climate leadership is a bit of a journey, and we very much feel that is the case. And what we're going to be doing with you on this webinar now for the next hour or so is to talk you through what we see that journey to climate leadership being. Effectively, we see that you can see there's 4 key areas. One is very much around getting your own house in order. That is understanding your current environmental impacts, complying with local regulations, disclosing your footprint. That's very much sort of the first basic step. Beyond that, moving up that arrow, we look at organizations and we can see many of the aspects of taking further responsibility. So setting clear and ambitious targets that are transparent, that can be tracked and reported on year, taking responsibility not just for your own organization, but also looking upstream of your organization into the supply chain, or considering the impact of your products and services across your full value chain. And then beyond your setting targets and your own value chain, the aspect that we see now is organizations are obviously looking to the future and understanding the broader risks and opportunities to their business. What's the context for them in terms of climate change in the future, and how will that be affecting their business? And the final top part of the arrow that you can see there underneath the title Climate Leadership is an area we'd like to explore with you on the webinar, talking about, well, what does a true leadership organization look like? How is it aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement? And what are the key actions that it should be undertaking to retain that leadership position on climate change? So with that, and moving on, and apologies for my voice, got a bit of a cold at the moment, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay. I'm going to pass over at this stage, though, to my colleague Pauline, who's going to take us through that first section of compliance and disclosure. Pauline.
Yeah, so we'll be starting with compliance and disclosure, which to our mind is, a company really just starting to get its own house in order. And that starts with an organizational footprint and maybe some assurance of that as well to kind of credibly communicate that they have taken that first step. So what does an organizational footprint look like? So essentially, this only covers the boundary of your own operational control. And to get into the technical language, that's what we call a scope 1 and a scope 2 footprint. So scope 1 is your direct emissions, which covers any fuel combustion, owned transport, any process emissions if you're operating a manufacturing site, and any fugitive emissions. So that would cover things like if you have any air conditioning leaks, for example, and if that has to be replaced. And then you have scope 2 emissions, which are the utilities, so your indirect emissions, which are purchased electricity, heat, and steam. So these are directly to your operations. These are, things that energy that you procure. And essentially, we have the view that this is the first step that a company should take to really understand what their own footprint is and what they have the most direct control over. So that might be looking at, doing energy efficiency investments to reduce those emissions, and perhaps also to procure renewable energy to really, almost get rid of that scope 2 category. So it really is best practice to do that accounting and then to build a strategy to increase energy efficiency and reduce emissions, which we will get into in the next section. And the reason why this is best practice is not only so that you know what your own impact is, but if you are a business whose impact lies more in the value chain, it's very difficult to engage your suppliers to reduce their emissions if you don't have your own house in order. So that is why we suggest you do that first. And we've been doing that, since we began, and have conducted over 1,700 organizational footprints. So the next step, if you have calculated an organizational footprint, would be to perhaps do some assurance around that. So when it comes to the organizational assurance, the Carbon Trust has a number of product offerings. The first start with our own proprietary standards. So that's the Carbon Trust standard for carbon. And then we also have water and waste, as well as zero waste to landfills. So these standards are our own standards, and they came about from our perceived need 10 years ago, that when companies were starting on their sustainability journey, that perhaps not all messages were equal, and that some were not founded in truth. So that's why we started the Carbon Trust standard for carbon, so that we could assure that companies were actually making the carbon reductions that they claimed they were making. So it certifies that you make an annual reduction. And then there's also a qualitative element to it, where we certify that you are doing the right things to achieve those reductions, and then also give advice on how to further that. So that structure is the same for waste and water. Then we also have the PAS 2060 standard, which is the carbon neutrality standard, where we certify that companies are committed to reducing their emissions and offsetting any emissions they have remaining. Then there's ISO 50001, which is the environmental management system. We also do ISO 14001. And then the final two are specific international standards for certifying just a carbon footprint. And then you see the carbon measured logo that then would be attributed to that assurance. Then the other kinds of assurance that we have are for products. So if you produce a product that perhaps is lower carbon than your competitors, or it's a product where you have really committed to reducing that footprint, we can not only calculate those footprints, we co-authored the PAS 2050 standard for product footprinting, but we can also assure that footprint and help you communicate with those logos below to your customers, whether that's B2B or B2C, about the carbon credentials of your products. Then we also have the supply chain standard, which conducts scope 3 footprinting in line with the methodology we have laid out for the supply chain standard, and that to varying levels assures that you are indeed engaging your suppliers and making reductions in your value chain. And then one of our newest offerings is around climate finance. So we recently developed a green finance team in-house. It was previously work done that was across the team, but now we have a dedicated team that does only climate finance related projects, and a lot of that assurance work is around verifying green bonds in accordance with the Climate Bond Initiative. So an example of that is GetLink, which was formerly known as the Eurotunnel Group. They have held the standard since 2009, so that's the Carbon Trust Standard for carbon, and that covers all of their operations. So if you take the Eurotunnel or GetLink this summer for your holidays, you will see the Carbon Trust Standard logo on their trains. And the reason that they've been working with us for so long is that they not only really benefit from having their reduction initiatives assured by us, but our advice through the Carbon Trust Standard has also helped them cut their emissions year on year, which has also translated into cost savings. And as you can see from this Chief Operating Officer's quote, it also kind of commits them to their ongoing work to reduce their emissions. So that's the first element. That's getting your own house in order and certifying that and demonstrating to your stakeholders that you have done so. So the next stage on the journey to climate leadership is really about taking responsibility. So you've looked at your footprint, you know where your impact is, but now it's really time to do something with that and to take responsibility for your impact and look to reduce it. So we see companies that are in this area really now are playing along with the pack. So this is really what all companies should be doing. So the first element of that is developing a sustainability strategy and implementing some targets aligned with your own operations. So the target setting scene has changed quite a lot over the past few years, going from the marketing team saying we should reduce by 20% by 2020 because that sounds nice, now to having targets that are based in science. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative came out of the Paris Agreement, which was made for governments. So the initiative felt that it would be an excellent idea to fill that policy gap by helping companies commit to the agreement as well. So essentially, the Science-Based Targets Initiative lays out a methodology for companies to align themselves and their targets with a global temperature increase of well below 2 degrees. So what that looks like is that you, as a company, have a carbon budget today as part of your sector, as part of the wider global economy. And according to the IPCC climate reports, there is a climate budget in 2050 or 2030 that we have to reach in order to avoid a global temperature increase beyond 2 degrees. So you, the target you choose is actually just informed by science rather than something that you choose based on what sounds nice from a marketing perspective or what goes with your investment plan. These are really far-reaching targets that are based in science and help a company communicate to their stakeholders that they are operating in a way that is aligned with science and the Paris Agreement and what the world needs to do in order to avert catastrophic climate change. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is the body that sits behind that. It was a joint initiative between the CDP, the UN Global Compact and the World Resources Institute and the WWF. And essentially they oversee these targets that companies set if they wish to have those validated and in order to be a part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So they've set out a range of methodologies that they approve of, predominantly the sectoral decarbonization approach, which is a great tool to really understand you as a company as part of a sector. What is your responsibility in that sector to reduce and help that sector and then the world reduce emissions so that we can stick to a well below 2 degree or even a 1.5 degree scenario. So the framework itself, you would set a scope 1 and 2 target as well as a scope 3 target if your emissions in scope 3 are above 40% of your total emissions. So scope 3 is your entire value chain, and that's something that we'll discuss in the ensuing slides. So it really is a full engagement piece. It's not only your own operations, but it really recognizes that a lot of companies have most of their impacts in their value chain. So through also setting a value chain target, you're really addressing your entire impact on climate change. So one of the companies that we have done that work with was the Carlsberg Group. So we supported them to not only measure their whole value chain footprint, but also to help them set science-based targets for their scope 1 and 2, so their own operations, as well as their value chain target, their scope 3 target. And then we also helped them to develop a roadmap to meet these targets. So I actually did work on this project. It was 2 years ago. And essentially what they wanted to do was to reduce the beer in hand carbon footprint, so that they've really set it in a way that makes sense to their consumer. And as a part of that project, we then looked, as you can see at this graphic, we looked at every stage of the life cycle of the beer they produce and gave them advice on how they can achieve that 30% reduction. And this is, driving their global strategy, not only in terms of their carbon emissions, but really the entire way that they operate their company. And it's been a huge benefit to them to really solidify that sustainability strategy in these science-based targets as a responsible company that is doing their bit, so to speak. So as I mentioned, a part of the requirements for setting science-based targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to do value chain or scope 3 footprinting. So as you can see in the graphic, there are 15 categories associated with scope 3 emissions. And these will mean different things to different companies. So for example, a fashion brand, their highest category will be purchased goods and services, that they, the goods that they purchase from the manufacturers. For financial services institute, it will be the use of their products, so the actual impact of the investments that they make. So these categories will be more intensive for different companies. However, in most cases, these are the categories in which a company has the biggest carbon impact rather than their own operations, which is why the Science-Based Targets Initiative has deemed this to be a necessary component of a science-based target. So several years ago, we co-authored the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Scope 3 footprinting calculations. So we have calculated many complex value chain footprints after co-authoring this standard, and have a lot of experience in not only calculating these footprints, but also helping clients to understand what this means to them, given that it is your indirect emissions. How do you engage your suppliers? How do you, really make those carbon efficiencies that also translate into cost savings with your relationships with the suppliers, and maybe even engaging your suppliers to really innovate the products that you procure from them and to really transform your business and theirs. So again, one of the examples of a company that we've done that work with is ThyssenKrupp. So we helped them not only to create a value chain footprinting tool to evaluate the upstream and downstream impacts of their businesses globally, but it really helped them kind of do an analysis of, if they changed certain elements, how would this transform their emissions, but also how could this transform their business? And this was sort of the first global steel manufacturer to really do this work, which is clearly, quite a carbon intensive company. So they were really leading the way when they did this work with us. And again, it has really transformed their business, the way they interact with their suppliers, and the way that they, communicate to their customers as well, their impact on climate change. And then finally, we have product footprinting, which I alluded to in our assurance slide. So this is where companies would like to understand what the carbon impact is of a specific product. So again, the kind of boundaries of this will depend for different organizations. If you're in the agricultural space, you might just want to know what the impact is of the farming aspect of a product. You procure or create, whereas others may want to know the manufacturing elements, including distribution and retail, but then also for many products it's useful to know what the use phase is and also what the carbon impact is associated with disposal or recycling. So it's very important when you do a product carbon footprint to really decide which one of these boundaries is the most material to you, and then once this footprint is created, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that we can assure, so that if you do indeed have a lower carbon product, this is something that you can communicate to your customers through the use of our certification services. And again, similarly to Scope 3, we co-authored the internationally recognized standard PAS 2050 to do these kinds of footprints. So we really do have a very experienced in-house team to deliver these kinds of projects. So an example of that work was Samsung. So for the Galaxy S2 and the Galaxy Note, these are actually the first mobile devices to have a certified carbon footprint, and they display the Carbon Trust footprint label. So not only does this label communicate to Samsung customers that that Samsung has taken the responsibility to understand what the carbon impact is of these products, it has also having this information has also helped Samsung reduce some of the use of packaging materials compared to the predecessors of these products. So doing the footprint has really helped them understand, okay, which areas of that boundary that I showed here, which elements of these stages are the most carbon intensive and where can we make those reductions? And through doing that accounting and then really making those reductions, they have been able to communicate that through the use of our logo. So now I'll hand it back over to Tom to take us through the final two stages of the leadership journey.
Great, thanks, Pauline. And yeah, so where are we on this journey so far that we've been taking you? So we've talked a little bit, obviously, about getting our own house in order, setting targets and understanding the impact of your value chain and how that has an impact across, your supply chain, the use of your products, and so on. So this is all very much about how your organizations have impacts on the environment. I guess looking forward, there's a question about, well, how will your organizations be impacted by climate change? So this is from the outside in. And that very much sort of takes us into the territory of trying to sort of scope and understand what's happening in the future, almost using a crystal ball, if you like, understanding, well, what is the risk to your business? What are the opportunities to your business going forward in terms of climate change? And there's an increasing demand really for this information. I think, generally, from the Carbon Trust perspective, we've worked with thousands of different organizations on footprinting, in terms of setting targets as well. These are generally seen as the sort of health factors nowadays. I think, leading organizations are moving beyond that to think about certainly how credible are their strategies moving forward in time, what is the sort of risk and financial impact of their businesses, and how are they positioning themselves to really maximize the opportunity in this transition to a low carbon economy. So this takes us on to the next section then. Just before I go there, in terms of some of the reasons for that demand, I think we can draw it out in terms of some of the key aspects that have occurred over the last year or two. Last year we had the publication of the IPCC's 1.5 degree centigrade report. That was very much sort of pointing out the dangerous impacts of exceeding just the 1.5 degree target. Obviously, right now we're already at the 1 degree target. So the imperative, I think, for taking action on climate change is increasing. The report, the specific report, the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC, laid out the very dramatic physical impacts of climate change, those impacts on social aspects, on communities, on our financial and viability in our economies worldwide. So that was certainly a key report. And then beyond that, I think we've also had the insurance community waking up to this in a big way. 2017, 2018 was the largest year. It was a record year in terms of payouts. Over 225 billion was paid out in compensation to organisations who suffered instances of extreme weather, which are more directly linked back to climate change in terms of the severity of those weather events and the occurrence going forward. So the other aspect beyond the IPCC report, beyond sort of instances of extreme weather and the insurance payout of that, is the World Economic Forum I draw to as well. The World Economic Forum consistently, and more recently within the latest report, ranking climate change as the top global risk facing the world right now. So we have this demand then, this demand to understand how financially viable is your business going forward. And that takes us to this initiative called the Taskforce for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD for short. And so that's been instigated by the G20, and that's specifically the Financial Stability Board of the G20. And that's representing pension funds, insurance community, investment community, who are concerned about where they're investing their money and whether or not there is a significant financial risk associated with the individual businesses and the industries in which their money is held. So they've brought out this recommendation to try and improve the transparency of businesses who are reporting on climate change. Not only are they wanting to see, is this business setting a target? Are they part of the solution here? Are they aligned? But also they're wanting to see to what extent, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there with the onion effect, they're looking for these 4 key criteria. So taking the first one there, governance, they were wanting to understand, well, what's the respective roles of the board and management team in managing risk and opportunities, and to what extent is climate change risk part of that conversation and review process? The strategy of a business, to what extent has the strategy of an individual business identified the risks and opportunities with climate change and understands how those risks and opportunities are going to impact the business over time, and over time taking into account different time horizons that might occur with different scenarios of the future, and how those risks and opportunities are impacting the strategic and financial planning of the business over time. So the third area down there, risk management. That's obviously, risk management, bread and butter to many businesses, but the key question here from the TCFD is to what extent is climate change risks and opportunities highlighted within those management frameworks of the business, and to what extent is the business on the front foot of identifying those risks and mitigating or reducing the impact of those risks over time. And the final point there in the middle, metrics and targets. All businesses respond to targets. It's part of the DNA in that respect. They want to measure how they're progressing, and obviously climate change targets and having metrics to respond to risks and understand how they're progressing over time is absolutely fundamental. So that's the background behind TCFD. It's just the demand for greater transparency in terms of risks and opportunities. But in terms of those risks and opportunities, just to clarify for those of you where TCFD might be a newer topic, risks are defined in terms of both physical risks of climate change, so physically from changing weather patterns, how will you be physically impacted by climate change? That's not just your own operations, but obviously your supply chain as well. And the transition risks are those risks around governments around the world who are committed to the Paris Agreement, implementing regulation to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from their economies. We have also that's a regulatory transition risks. We have market transition risks as well in terms of the new markets for lower carbon goods and services. And how will those transition risks, both market and regulatory, impact your business as well? So those are the physical risks and transition risks as well. And obviously opportunities for businesses are those businesses who are aligning themselves to that future transition and getting an advantage from those opportunities as well. So businesses, I said, are well versed, I guess, in identifying risks and opportunities to their business. Where they have a challenge, and from our experience in working with businesses, is they have a real challenge in this sense of quantifying the financial impact of these physical and transition risks and opportunities from a climate change perspective on their business. So it's the quantification which is more of a challenging piece, and that's what over the next few slides I'm going to try and take you through. So on the next slide, sorry, I have to pause for some water, excuse me. So on the next slide, we can see in the middle here, we can see business value in the middle, and then we have 6 value drivers that are going to affect the financial viability of that business around the outside of that triangle. So we have regulation and policy affecting the business, we have access to finance, we have customer demand, we have their supply chains in terms of the cost of commodities in their supply chains, physical impacts, as I mentioned earlier, how will that impact the business, and access to technologies and the, I guess, the current capabilities of those technologies. So what we're wanting to understand is how will the risks and opportunities around climate change affect these value drivers on the business? Are they going to be increasing the value, or are they going to be eroding that value to the business? So taking the first one here, we can see policy and legal risk around climate change. So this could be instances around carbon pricing introductions, trading schemes, introduction of new product standards on energy efficiency of products, available capital to the business, or compliance costs. Those are all costs, effectively risks that might impact regulation and policies or access to finance. And the next area here shown here in terms of market opportunities. So what new market opportunities or incentives are going to be provided in the transition to a low carbon economy? And those are shown here in terms of green, so opportunity to the business. But conversely, for businesses who don't take advantage of this transition, they might be left as a laggard, leaving behind. So how will the shift in the market, and as a result of that shift in consumer attitudes and perceptions of businesses, have a negative impact perhaps on their reputational risk as well? So, and as we go around the triangle here, you can see energy sources, so shift to renewables, lower cost of renewables, having an opportunity for a business. Indeed, many parts of the world where there are subsidies in place for adopting renewable technologies. And the risk associated with that energy transition is obviously around fossil fuels being phased out, having stranded assets within your business, or indeed, the increase in energy efficiency standard. How might that pose a risk to the technologies, not just the technologies you operate within your own assets, but also technologies that you produce and sell to your consumers, customers as well. So moving on round, we have products and services. As I mentioned, there's definite and clear opportunity in terms of low carbon products and services. It's a booming market in that sense. So to what extent is the business taking advantage on the front foot for that? Can understand how their current portfolio needs to transition. Are they making suitable investments now in technology innovation, in research and development? What are the costs associated with that? So being able to gain that new customer, those new markets. And conversely, from a supply chain, you can see the market risk there. Uncertainty around future commodity prices might be a future risk, and the supply chain risk to the businesses as well. And then moving on, we have resource efficiency as an opportunity to the business. So broader resource efficiency opportunities, both from production and distribution of products and services. And then moving on around the diagram there, we have the sort of the physical risks and opportunities. So shown by both the opportunity to be more resilient, to what extent are you building in risk avoidance within your business? How can you communicate that risk avoidance and the measures you're taking to be more flexible or more adaptable to the physical impacts of climate change, not just in your own operations, but from your supply chain as well? How are you working with your suppliers to equip them as well? So, and how are you avoiding physical business interruption to your own operations or your supply chain, or avoiding write-off of your assets as well? So those are some of the ways in which you're understanding from a TCFD perspective, how are these climate change risks and opportunities impacting the value drivers of your business? Are they having a positive or a negative impact over time? And if we move on to the next slide, you can see a schematic here. So the objective really of TCFD is to analyze this and to quantify it, and to quantify that for the business so it can inform strategic decision making. So you can see here simplified, very vastly simplified diagram, but the type of activity that we would go through with many businesses is shown on this simplified slide here. So we would understand how the business creates its value currently. How does it capture value? How does it source it from its supply chain, its raw materials? How does it operate? And then what are the products and services it provided? So understanding then across all of those range of physical risks and opportunities I showed you on the previous slide, how do they map against those different value drivers of the business? And not just doing it on a large macro level, but diving into different business units and understanding the impact of different geographies as well. So understanding how this is going to be impacting specific businesses units in terms of potentially a value creation opportunity for those business areas, or indeed it might be a loss of value and a risk to those businesses over time. So those are the simplified, I guess, ways in which we would start to help businesses quantify that. So it's a lot of financial modeling, and for many sustainability teams, it's actually not something that they're familiar with. It creates a real opportunity to engage with all of the different parts of the business who influence the business planning cycle. So, investor relations, financial planning, product sales, all of these teams need to be engaged in with this exercise of quantifying the financial risks and opportunities of climate change. And on this next slide, the necessity to look at different scenarios as well. So you can see on the slide here, on the top of the slide there, we can see a 4-degree scenario for value driver 1 and a 2-degree scenario for value driver 1. So under a 2-degree scenario, it becomes more likely that there's a value creation opportunity for the business. In this scenario, under 2-degree scenario, it assumes that the world is mobilizing effectively. Governments have got the political will and backing, and we achieve our sort of climate change targets. Under the 4-degree scenario, obviously that same value driver is impacted very differently because we've overshot our targets here, and it's a warmer world. The world hasn't adapted as it should have, and the value creation opportunity has decreased, and the likelihood as well has decreased as well. And then the same vein, you look at all of the different value drivers and how they're impacted under these different scenarios. So value driver 2 has a vastly different impact under a 4 degrees versus a 2-degree scenario in terms of the scale of that risk to the business and the likelihood increasing with a 4-degree piece. So it's important then to understand, what are these value drivers of the business, how are they impacted under these different scenarios. What I would say as well, this is very much a sort of an iterative process. Businesses that we supported in this area start off with this sort of analysis. They'll understand where are the most material impacts and how are they impacted in terms of those different value drivers, and then they go into more detailed analysis. It does take time, and on the next slide, talking you through that schematic from left to right, we have the sort of the typical Gantt chart, as you were, which builds how you develop a response to TCFD over time. So the first column there, where we've understood, well, what are the sort of typical risks and opportunities from climate change? How do they manifest themselves? What's the specific context for your business? So what are the specific value drivers to the business? What are the key characteristics of your company and how it creates value, and how might that sector be changing currently? Once you've built that business model, you're overlaying on top of that a number of climate scenarios that you can source, and either you're selecting a 2-degree scenario or an NDC, nationally determined contribution scenario, or a 4-degree scenario, but effectively you're applying those scenarios and considering over towards the right-hand side of the chart there, what's the revenue impact on your business, what's the impact on your margins, and as you can see on the right-hand side, it's identifying those responses. So based on that scenario analysis, is your current strategy feasible? How does it react to these risks and opportunities? Are you on the right course of action, or actually has your business strategy been developed in complete isolation of these climate change risks and opportunities? And that's the point, really. You have the dialogue really with these businesses. It's important to engage them in this process throughout, but effectively it's the end goal here is to identify what are those gaps, where do you need to drive further investigation in terms of risks and opportunities of business, and how does your strategy need to adapt to meet those demands? So as we've been illustrating throughout this presentation, really, Carbon Trust can provide a range of different supports. So we provide exploratory workshops for the businesses. We help conduct gap analysis exercises in terms of what are you currently doing in comparison to the requirements of TCFD. What are the risks and opportunities? So helping to do that initial screening with businesses is something we've done a lot of. And also, of course, as I've just shown you, some of the scenario analysis, so actually taking that quantification a step further, rather than simply looking at it from a qualitative perspective, but doing that quantitative analysis, and indeed figuring out how your climate change strategies need to evolve as a result of that form of analysis. So that's very much sort of taken us through that topic. So allowing us a little bit more time for some discussion. I know maybe some people have some questions. Just to let you know, we have got some, we will be distributing the slides obviously after the webinar. So taking us to this final topic then, journey to climate leadership. So we've reached the summit where climate leadership, so effectively what is it? Well, it involves all of the aspects. You've been no surprise to hear that you've been covering on this webinar so far. It's all of these aspects and ensuring that you're aligning yourselves with the aims and objectives of the Paris Agreement. So to give you a very much a sort of a sneak preview of something that the Carbon Trust is developing right now, we'll be launching in June a new service called the Climate Leadership Framework. And we're very excited about this because we were basically trying to map out what is it that businesses need to be doing to align themselves with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and align themselves with sort of an economy that's compatible with the futures of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So we've been working with a number of businesses during this year. We've been working with manufacturing organizations, food brands, media organizations, organizations working in terms of energy distribution and the education sector. And we've been looking at those organizations and reviewing their progress and understanding, what are they currently doing in terms of climate change leadership, and how, from the Carbon Trust perspective, given all of our experience developing standards, frameworks across the world in terms of organizational frameworks, product frameworks, and so on, how would we rank their efforts? Are they really on track, or what are the blind spots in their strategies, and what should they really be addressing? So we developed the Climate Change Leadership Framework, which looks a little bit like this on a simplified level. So we're looking to understand what are the 5 key activities streams that businesses need to be undertaking, not only to undertake optimization now, so that's understanding where they are now, what the target needs to be, developing an implementation plan, but what are the key aspects that really need to be board in terms of planning now that will transform this business towards a future sort of 2050 scenario and a future that's aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So the 5 activity streams you can see on the left-hand side there are the targets. So we're assessing to what extent is this business's target ambitious. Are they aligning themselves with a 2-degree world, or are they going a step further to look at beyond 2 degrees or a 1.5-degree world? What's the time frames for that target? Is it really through to 2050, or have they only got the next 5 to 10 years in their sights? What are they science-based targets, or are they specific targets for renewables? Are they carbon neutral targets? Excuse me. And to what extent do they have a clear plan in place? To what extent have they looked at the costings of investment, when these projects need to be implemented over time? Do they have a clear-cut program of efficiency measures and renewable energy projects across their own assets, their factories, or even if they operate a fleet, to what extent are they considering ultra-low emission vehicles as part of that solution? So those are the first 2 aspects. Contextual analysis, as I've just been mentioning on the previous slide, section of this webinar is around contextual analysis around climate change. So what are the risks and opportunities to those businesses, and how are their strategies reacting to that? So to what extent are they taking that into account? The innovation, this is taking into account that businesses really need to innovate their business models over time, not only in terms of the way that they derive value from their business, the way they provide products and services, the choice of materials and so on. Opportunities for circular economy are looked at in this particular section, as indeed are sort of innovative uses of technology and renewables and so on. So, and this last activity you can see in the purple color here is influencing. So we're wanting to understand to what extent is this business not just resting on their laurels, but to what extent are they influencing Many businesses need to have the, I guess, regulatory framework to prove the business case and to transition to the low carbon economy. So rather than just sort of waiting for that to happen, are these businesses actively lobbying? Are they actively engaging with supply chain, with governments to make those frameworks effective? So these are the 5 categories of activity that we're looking to evaluate. And we're looking to evaluate to what extent, as you can see on the right-hand side, is the business addressing that within their own operations in terms of targets, implementation, innovation, and so on, across the value chain. So to what extent are they looking at the value chain impacts, and where do those value chain impacts lie for those specific businesses? As Pauline mentioned earlier on the conversation today, up to 60 to 90% of the impact can lie outside the own operations of a business in their supply chain or in their products and services. So that's a really important area to keep track of. And the last one here is enablement of avoided emissions. Some organizations aren't too clear what we mean by that, but effectively this is a category where through the provision of your products and services to your customers, you're enabling your customers to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So one example here might be an innovative new food product might be many of the sort of plant-based protein products that are trying to appeal to meat eaters and to shift those organizations, consumers away from meat into a lower carbon choice. So you're avoiding emissions in that sense. Other companies like the IT sector do that by providing innovative technology solutions to enable businesses to operate more efficiently and avoid emissions in that respect. So there's a whole range of different areas in which enablement is a key area, and it's a key area that's very much sort of aligned to businesses who are sort of trying to develop a positive message on climate, not just reducing their own impacts, but going the next step further. So on the next slide, you can see how we begin to score this. So we look at our 5 criteria, and in the diagram here is shown for own operations. And we're scoring organizations from 1 to 4 in terms of how they meet those criteria. So in this scenario, this example, the organization hasn't set ambitious targets. So, they've got an initial target expiring in 2020, as you can see here, but they need to set science-based targets. That's a fundamental thing for that. They need to start addressing implementation. Other things to pick out here is they've done some initial qualitative assessment of risks and opportunities, but they need to transition to look at quantitative analysis on own operations. And in terms of innovation, they may have done some initial work here. As you can see, they've reached level 1, but there's a much larger gap in terms of their understanding of how they need to innovate going forward to the Paris Agreement. So moving on to the next slide, just wrapping up this section. So the climate leadership framework that we're developing has sort of 2 key aspects to it. We want to develop this scorecard to help organizations understand how do they score against the various aspects of climate change leadership. And then we want to help them and support them to develop a roadmap going forward. So what are the key aspects they need to be addressing within the short to medium term and the longer term within their organization? So key things to define this service is there are no lengthy questionnaires. We're not asking organizations to fill in a long list of questions with this service. The review that we're going to be doing is purely based on current disclosures, things that we can find on your website and your sustainability reports. And we'll conduct that analysis and have an initial scorecard review with your organization. You can then supplement that information with any internal documents and internal initiatives that haven't yet been published before we develop our final scoring. We're expecting most organizations to score very, very low actually on this. It's an opportunity, I guess, for many organizations to shine a light on their broad range of their strategies, to take a holistic approach and to allow them to engage with their senior leadership teams and to engage alongside the Carbon Trust as an independent organization with our recommendations about how you should be moving forward in that sense. So the final slide in the deck, just to wrap up, climate leadership framework, we obviously do a lot of assessment in terms of your progress. And I think the link here is to CDP as well. It can be made quite directly. So many organizations are concerned about their CDP scores. Going through this climate leadership framework can help organizations understand how effectively to fill in the CDP questionnaires, and indeed to what extent for shadow scoring that we've conducted with many organizations for their CDP scores in the past, conducting shadow scoring to understand where they are now and what more they need to do to improve their scoring and reach the next level of management or leadership level. So shadow scoring, is a quick and easy way to understand what those key recommendations should be to move forward. So
I'll give Tom the chance to rest his voice. Thank you very much for listening. So we've had some questions already, but please feel free if you have any to type them into the questions box as I start to answer the first few. So the first, there's sort of a selection of questions about how we actually sort of work as an organization. So given that, we do have international offices, however, most of our work is done remotely. So despite our various locations, we obviously want to reduce our own carbon impact. So we do most of our work remotely, and that's principally because it's mainly data driven. So most of our engagement with clients is across the phone or in webinars like this, and via email to obtain the data that we need to do our really detailed analysis. Of course, any workshops that are a part of the projects, many of the ones that we've just described, especially the last one, these are of course done in person because we really value stakeholder engagement when it comes to the climate leadership framework, the TCFD, value chain footprinting, target setting. It's all well and good for the sustainability team to have all this information, and you have those jobs because you believe in it. But we think having engagement workshops with other key decision makers within an organization, especially when it comes to target setting, is really important because we want them to have the buy-in during the project, not for you to deliver the outputs after the project. So those are delivered face to face because we really value that, and we want the work that we do to have a lasting impact and to gain buy-in from the key decision makers within your organization early on. And we are a global organization, so we can also deliver work in various languages. And so if that's something that's very important for the stakeholder engagement piece, for example, there are most European languages we can deliver in, and some other ones as well, and we can draw on other teams if necessary. So one of the questions was as well to send over the slides, which we will of course do after the meeting. And a final question, because obviously we do most of the work as consultants, but there was a question on how much internal resource is required for some of the projects that we do. So that really depends project to project. It also depends on how much you do want to do. So we can very much guide our client interaction dependent on the need of the organization. So if we're, for example, doing a Scope 3 footprint that would draw on data from many different departments within an organization, the logistics team, procurement, maybe not just the sustainability team, we can do that engagement for you. We can help those team members get the data we need. Equally, it can be very light touch on our end and more involvement on your end in the data gathering. So the resource required really depends on what level of engagement you already have with your colleagues when it comes to data gathering, and whether or not you already have internal systems in place for this data gathering. So we really vary it depending on the client need. And then in terms of project length, I would say sort of these projects do sort of start at 3 months. And for the larger pieces, such as the value chain footprinting, the target setting, they can go on several months after that. And again, a lot of that is dependent on how difficult it is to gather the data and to engage with other people within your organizations in order to obtain that. So yeah, if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll end it for now. We will be in touch after the webinar, so you'll have a contact placed with you who is best to deal with your sector. So if you do have any other questions following the webinar, or if you wanted to have some more information on any of the specific services that we've addressed today, you can pick up with one of our colleagues who will be in touch soon. So yeah, thank you very much for attending. We hope that it was useful and that you've been inspired to continue or start your climate change leadership journey.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.